Really appreciate. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to day 2 of this AVD Immersion Day. On behalf of Ingram teams from US and Canada, I'd like to welcome you once again. We really appreciate everybody taking time off their busy schedule and joining us. We know that we are going through this pandemic, but we want to make sure that we are still able to connect, and that's why we are doing these events. My name is Girish Sharma, and I'm Azure Solution Engineer based out of Mississauga, Canada. We also have some of the folks joining from our Ingram's US team, so thank you and welcome to them too. Today is day 2, and if anybody has joined yesterday, if you remember, we concentrated on how we can position Azure Virtual Desktop and what are the business case scenario depending upon customer requirement. In today's session, we're going to focus more on the architectural design and the sizing, depending upon different components which are needed to spin up these services. And tomorrow, going to be a full day affair. So whatever we're going to learn today and what we did yesterday, based on that, we'll be doing hands-on lab. And I think it was mentioned yesterday too that if we can have one person per organization, that will be great for the lab specifically, because the way these are designed, we need to pre-provision certain things so that you can come and deploy these labs. So we have specific numbers only, and we want to make sure that we get as much as coverage in our partner base. So if we can have one person per organization joining and doing those labs, that will be great. And also after these 3 days, we are also planning to have one-on-one session. So the sales team will be reaching out to you, and we do understand that every scenario is different. So you want to make sure that we also have some dedicated time with each partner. So wait for that communication. So depending upon your geography where you are, the respective sales team is going to reach out, and then we're also going to schedule one-on-one call with you. This is how the agenda looks today for today's session. We'll go through the reference architecture, in which we're going to talk about the identity storage network. There has been some new additions in AVD, so we're going to talk about that too, in what's new in AVD part. Then we're going to shift gears and talk about the best practices when it comes to sizing and performance guidance. We'll also walk you through the pricing calculator. There has been some recent changes in the pricing calculator, so that workflow has changed. So I'll make sure that we also touch upon that. And then we're going to discuss the image management, automation, and monitoring, followed by different high availability scenarios that we need to have in practice, whether it's AVD or some of the other deployment that you might be considering, and also from disaster recovery and business continuity. And in the end, we're going to do a brief demo of how to find these services and spin up. And we'll take any questions in the end. So if you have any question during this, if you want to put that in the chat, it is being monitored with some of the folks from Ingram Micro team, so they can maybe answer that, or otherwise we can also take those questions in the end. So let's start with the reference architecture. And we're going to straight away dive into the enterprise class scale architecture when it comes to AVD implementation. And as you can see on this slide, we have two parts. We have on the left side of the slide on-prem environment, in which you have your Active Directory domain services. You have also Azure AD Connect server. Now it is recommended that when we are trying to sync users' password hash, we deploy AD Connect on a dedicated machine and not on a domain controller. And that is what you see on the left side of this slide in on-prem environment, that there is a dedicated machine and it is syncing the user password hash and user credential to Azure Active Directory. And on the right side, you'll see the virtual network in which all the different components that are needed to make this service run in AVD are there. You have your compute, storage, networking component, and you also see the Windows Virtual Desktop control plane. So when it comes to AVD infrastructure, it is a shared responsibility model. There are certain components which are taken care by Microsoft, such as gateway, connection broker, diagnostic, and web access, which otherwise you have to provision if you have deployed remote desktop infrastructure, whether it's on-prem on the cloud. These are different servers role that you need to configure. But the good thing about the Azure Virtual Desktop Deployment is that overhead things are taken care by Microsoft for you. So that's what you see in the top under Azure Active Directory. And just underneath that, you have the different components. And we see that a lot of partners, they use a hub and spoke kind of deployment, in which in the hub virtual network, you have services which are going to be shared with different components, whether it's AVD or some other architecture or other resources that you have. And in this case, you see that you have a gateway subnet in which there's a connectivity to back on-prem. Now, to establish that connectivity, we can have a couple of options. You can either have a site-to-site VPN connectivity by using VPN gateway, which is Azure service, or you can use an express route, which establishes a dedicated link between your on-prem to the cloud resources. The difference between these two services is that with site-to-site VPN connectivity, the traffic flows over a public internet, whereas in express route, a dedicated pipe is deployed. So in this case, the traffic goes over a dedicated link, so you can expect lesser latency and better performance. And for both these two options, there are different tiers depending upon what kind of bandwidth requirement are. You can go all the way from 100 Mbps to 5 gigabit per second in site-to-site VPN connectivity. And similar to that, there are different options and different tiers also available within Express Route. So as you can see on the Hub Virtual Network, along with the VPN gateway, we also have NVA or Network Virtual Appliance. Now you have this flexibility of deploying maybe Azure Firewall, which is another PaaS offering, or if you feel comfortable, maybe using some third-party appliances from Cisco, Barracuda. There are different companies which provides network virtual appliance right from the marketplace. You have that flexibility of deploying so that you have better control over the network and to the applications. And just underneath, you also see that we also have deployed Active Directory domain services in a high availability mode. Now I'm going to discuss HA options in more detail in the coming slide. But this will make sure that in case something happens to your on-prem AD server, the users, they are still able to authenticate. And that's why you see within the hub network, you have Active Directory deployed in availability set. And on the right side of this one, you see the desktops, which will be provisioned for the users. So this can be in a pooled environment or in a shared kind of environment, or you can have a dedicated one-to-one relationship. And these two networks are paired with VNet peering. So in case they have to access anything from the hub virtual network, they will have access. But I also see that a lot of customers, they put everything within one virtual network. But this way you can segregate the traffic you want. But at the same time, in case there is a dependencies between multiple virtual network, they'll be able to access that. And on the extreme right side, you see the storage options. When it comes to AVD deployment, and specifically with the pool kind of deployment, you still need to use the user profiles to store somewhere. And there are a couple of options available within AVD that you can use. And some of the options you see here are Azure Files and Azure NetApp Files, which is a platform as a service. But this is a typical architecture you will come across when it comes to the enterprise scale, in which you have on-prem, you have connectivity with your site-to-site or your express route, and then you have different components which are managed by you as a user. And there's also a control plane which is managed by Microsoft, such as web access, gateway broker, diagnostic. And you can bring the user credential and password hash. You can sync it by using AD Connect into Azure Active Directory. Moving forward, You will also come across a lot of scenarios in which there is no dependencies on-prem. So customer, they don't have any on-prem infrastructure, but they still want to use and deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. And that is the example that you see in this slide, in which customer might be already using Azure Active Directory. They have users in that, and they are deploying Azure Active Directory domain services. So as you know that when it comes to domain services, there are a couple of ways you can deploy this within Azure environment. One way of deploying this is as an infrastructure as a service in which you go and deploy the virtual machine. You can deploy this on a single machine, or you can deploy this in a pair for high availability. But if you don't want to manage it and you don't want to update it and you want to have the onus on Microsoft to manage, that's where Azure Active Directory domain services comes into play, because this is a managed services for domain services in which high availability is baked in. So by default, Microsoft is going to deploy two machines or two domain controller, which are highly available. It will make sure that the data is replicated between the two. So in case there is something happens to one machine, there is another machine which can take over the load. And it gives you all the flexibility that you are known with traditional domain controllers. It will allow you to domain join the machines. You can apply group policies. So everything is unlocked. But the good thing is that as a customer, you don't need to manage this. It's all taken care by Microsoft for you. And then for AVD deployment, very similar to the previous slide which I showed you, all the components such as compute, the host pool, the session host within that host pool, and the storage which is associated, everything can be deployed in the virtual network, and it can be integrated with Azure Active Directory domain services. And we see this common practice among customers who are starting anew and they don't have any dependencies on-prem and they want everything in the cloud. It's a great way of having highly available solution. And very similar to the first slide which I showed you, a lot of customers already having on-prem domain controller. They want to sync their credentials with Azure Active Directory by using Azure AD Connect. They can do that. They might be having application on-prem, and there are certain applications they have in cloud, and they want to have maybe single sign-on. All those capabilities are unlocked and can be configured when you are deploying that with Azure AD Connect. And you can use it to access these applications from any device. Now, Azure Virtual Desktop give you all the flexibility. You can use different operating system. You can access this to a web client, or you want to have this access from maybe from a Linux machine or Windows client, that can be done. And some of the other operating systems such as Android, iOS, you can use Apple devices to access these. So idea is that it doesn't matter from where the users want to access, whether it's from their on-prem location, from the head office or branch office, or they want to have those resources and applications and desktop access from their comfort of their room, from their house. They should be able to access that with all the security components in place. We also see this pretty frequently, this kind of architecture, and this can be deployed within the Azure Virtual Desktop deployment. Now let's look at the storage architecture with FS Logic's profile option. So as you know that with any AVD deployment, there are two ways you can do this. You can have this in a pooled environment, or you can have it in a personal environment. So take an example of an organization. So there is a company with a user base of 100. And you have this flexibility of deploying maybe 100 machines, which are dedicated for each user. But you can also provision this in a pool kind of environment in which you might not need to deploy 100 machines. Maybe 10 machines are okay, depending upon the application workload. But the problem arises right now how the user profiles are going to be taken care of. And that is where FS Logic profiles and FS Logics shine, because that is the underlying technology Microsoft is using to manage those user profile. And this company Microsoft bought a couple of years ago, and this is blended in with AVD technology and used for storing your user profile. Now, there are different options which can be used when it comes to storing these user profiles. So as you know that Azure File Storage is one of the options within Azure File Storage category. And in that, there are different tiers. You can go with standard, you can go with the premium tier. And within standard also, there are different options. You can go with hot, cool, or transactional optimize, depending upon what is your business requirement and what kind of throughput and performance and IOPS you want. You can pick one or the other. But the good thing is that as the user in a pool kind of environment, they hop from one machine to another, their user profile will be taken with them. And it is all stored within Azure File Storage, which is a platform as a service. So the good thing is that you don't need to manage it. You don't need to patch it or update. It's all taken care by Microsoft for you. And it fully integrates. So in case you're already using Windows Active Directory that you're trying to integrate with, or even if you are adopting maybe Azure Active Directory domain services, it fully integrates with the FS logics where you can also apply NTFS permissions. But the important thing here is that for user profiles, FS Logics is the technology that we're going to use. And for storing your user profile, there are different options available from a share in a file server or to PaaS offerings such as Azure File Storage or NetApp Files if you want to use any third-party offering. Now, this slide talks about the architecture, the networking architecture of Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, AVD uses reverse connectivity for accessing these AVD resources. Now, contrary, when we deploy a remote desktop infrastructure on-prem, it uses a TCP listener for inbound connectivity, whereas in Azure Virtual Desktop, an outbound connection is created over HTTPS so that user can access those resources. I'm not sure if the fonts are okay, but on this slide, you can see that there are different steps happen to ensure that connectivity. So for example, if you look at when the user is trying or the client is trying to access Windows Virtual Desktop Workspace, Azure Active Directory will authenticate that user and return the token. And once that token is passed on to Windows Virtual subscription, the Windows Virtual Desktop subscription will validate that token. And once that token is validated, the AVD subscription service will pass that, and the desktop and the remote applications which has been assigned to that specific user will be presented to them. Now you can give them access based on the full desktop depending upon the requirement, or you can give them access for only specific application which a user is assigned. But these are the steps which happens behind the scene for the users to provide that connectivity and access those desktop and application. And there's a link that we're going to share with you along with the slide deck so that you have a complete understanding of how that networking is taking place in the backend. Now, let's also talk about some of the recent features that has been added to Azure Virtual Desktop. As you know that AVD and Microsoft infrastructure is designed on a massive scale. There are multiple regions all across in different geographical boundaries. And as of today, if I remember, there are 60 plus regions, and this list keeps on increasing. If we talk about from the North American perspective, we have different region in Canada as well as in US. Where can you deploy these AVD resources? The idea here is that we want to give the optimum user experience, because cloud, yes, it gives you all the flexibility and scalability, but in the end, if the user they are not able to access those applications seamlessly and there is a latency, the whole idea of the cloud doesn't gel with the messaging that we want to give, right? So with the Azure Virtual Desktop, you can deploy this across multiple regions. In US, we have different region from coast to coast. In Canada, we have two. We have Central and East. And one of the requests from the Canadian region partners was that when you're deploying these AVD environment, the location of the metadata was not there. But the good thing is that now you can also deploy along with the session host, the host pool that you're deploying. You can also deploy the AVD metadata within the Canadian region. So in case you are dealing with any regulated industry, you're dealing with maybe health sector or financial industry, and they're very particular where their data are going to reside, you can make sure that and tell them now with AVD, you can also have that metadata residing within the boundary of that country, and it's not leaving that. And also the host pool and the session host within that host pool was always there. That can be deployed in any region. So that's one of the new things that has been added. So I just wanted to make sure that I address that specifically for the Canadian partner. And for US, it was always there. You can deploy that metadata within the US boundary. Another important ask that was there from our partner was that, yes, AVD is good, but there were still dependencies for this deployment on domain services. It can be on-prem, maybe what we discussed in the design or the architecture. It can be in form of domain controller in a physical or virtualized, or it can be in cloud in an infrastructure or in a platform as a service such as Azure Active Directory domain services. But I'm happy to tell that now with uh, going generally available last month only. Now you can deploy Azure, this Windows Virtual Desktop without having to deploy the domain controller. So there is no longer dependencies on those domain services. It can be fully gelled with Azure Active Directory, giving you the seamless experience. And this is where the technology is going. We want to give you the cloud first experience, and this gives you the roadmap where this services is going. And this will fully now integrate with Intune services to manage your devices through Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And if you have not tested, I will highly recommend that you would go and deploy these services with full Azure Active Directory integration, which is there for you to be provisioned and is now generally available. Now, cloud, as we talk about, is all about automation. And one of the other asks from our partner was that, yes, we can deploy these, we can have automations in place, but there was certain organization which has this requirement to allow users to start the VM on demand. Now, let's take an example. There was an organization that we were dealing with there in which they have only a specific time where the users wanted to use those services. So they have strict requirement in which the user wanted to have those AVD applications or desktop to be used between, say, for example, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. But then over a period of time, their requirement grew, and then they also wanted that to give the capabilities to certain users which can come and access those applications, do their work. And that option was not available for them. You either need to have those machines always up and running, which obviously adds to the cost, or you need to have some sort of scripting going. So now with this Start VM on Connect option, you can give the capability to the user who can come over there and they can start the VM from their side without having to give the administrative access. So you still have complete control as a system admin or as Azure Portal admin, but they can still do their work. They can still access the application that has been assigned to them. And once they are done, you can also have the combination of obviously Azure Automation scripting so that they are spun down once their work is done. But this was one of the asks from a lot of organization, and this is in place, and you can deploy that within the Azure portal, and you can make those changes within the RDP properties so that certain users will be able to spin those machines on demand. So definitely something that you want to test it out. If you have not tested, I would recommend go and check that out within the Azure portal. A very handy feature which has been now added to AVD portfolio. With that, we're going to shift gears and now we're going to talk about the sizing and performance, which we always see when we are trying to create a design, like how many machines, what size should be there. So hopefully this will give you an idea about, based on the requirement, how we can size an opportunity. So the example that you see on the slide in this case is for a POC kind of environment, which we think is very critical with any cloud deployment. And this specific use case scenario is for less than 20 users. And when we're designing any AVD deployment, it has to, we need to consider what kind of workload that we are catering to. And that translates into what kind of application that we're running. So we need to have at least some sort of understanding of application, whether it's compute intensive, whether it's going to be just basic internet serving or business or office application that they'll be doing. And based on that, we can design how many users per virtual CPUs that we can assign them, right? And that is what you see on the slide. You have workload type listed as light, medium, heavy, and power. So if you are using maybe these AVD applications for video rendering or for SolidWorks or for AutoCAD designing and drawing, then you want to use, or you will put that under the category of heavy and power and design your virtual machines accordingly within the host pool. So based on that, you can see we can assign that many CPUs, RAM, and the storage for the customer. And you can see then we have different Azure instance sizes. Now, if you have dealt with the Azure infrastructure, you know that there are different series of virtual machine that you have to deal with. And each virtual machine or the series of virtual machine, they are meant to do specific kind of job, right? For example, you have A series virtual machine, which are not generally recommended for production environment because they have the lowest compute power. But for AVD perspective, we see that D series virtual machine, they're very popular. And we see with a lot of our customer base who have deployed these series. And then there's also different version. You have version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, for example. And typically, as you move up in the version, it means that it comes with the latest capabilities and latest features. And they keep on adding more and more new virtual machine in these different families. But under example Azure instance, you can see that we have different series of virtual machine with D, F, and N series virtual machine. And you also have a certain machine with S series, which equates to that you can also deploy those machines with the premium storage. As you know that within storage, there are different kind of tiers. You can have a standard HDD, which is like your regular spinning hard drive. Then you have the standard SSD as well as premium SSD, which give you better performance, better IOPS. Typically for AVD deployment, it is recommended that we use a premium class storage, which give you better performance, better IOPS, and that is what you see in this example Azure instance category. And then along with what kind of machines that we're going to deploy in the host pool, we also need to provision and have storage for the user profiles, where user profile will be stored specifically in the multi-session, in which as the user, they move from session host to session host within the host pool, their profiles are taken care. And as I mentioned before, you can use this with the Azure file storage, which has different tiers, or you can use maybe NetApp files, but we also need to take that into perspective. And then at the bottom, you also see that you have the single session option. So you can deploy this in a multi-session mode or in a single session mode in which the user will have one-to-one relation. And typically for that, you can either use a D2S version 3 machine, and it is recommended that 2 physical CPUs are dedicated for that kind of environment. But also want to point out there are different kind of chipset which are there depending upon what class of machine you're using. For example, you have the Intel chipset for a regular D8S version 4, but maybe if you're using anything within D16AS, then you are using AMD chipset. So depending upon what you need, maybe you can pick one over the other, but that gives you an understanding of at least when you're trying to deploy that in a POC kind of environment for at least 20 user base, these things you need to take into perspective, depending upon the workload, the machines that we're going to deploy, what series of machine that we should be using, and also we need to provision for the user profile and where we will be storing that. This is an example of a production kind of environment for at least 20 or more users. And as you can see that under the example Azure instance, the series of virtual machine has more compute power. And rightly so, because this is a production environment, we want to make sure that the users who are trying to access those full desktops and remote application, they're getting consistent performance. And based on what kind of workload type, whether it's light, medium, heavy, or power, there is associated number of CPUs and the RAM that should be assigned to them, and also the user profiles where that will be stored, whether it's on Azure File Storage or on a NetApp file. And very similar to that, there is also single session option that generally don't change. It is very similar to the POC environment, but the maximum changes you're going to see in a multi-session kind of environment, where multiple users, they are trying to access same machines within the host pool. And definitely make use of this link. This talks about different recommendation based on different scenarios. So we'll also share this. This gives you different deployment options and what are the sizing that you need to take in perspective. So definitely a good link when you're trying to size any opportunity. If one tool that you should be familiar when you're trying to design any of these environments, I would recommend definitely look at pricing calculator, which I'm going to walk you through. The good thing about the pricing calculator is that there is built-in intelligence which is baked into this tool. This is from Microsoft. This is not third party. But based on whatever information you put in, it will give you information about what kind of computer you should be using, what kind of storage, based on how many users that we're trying to give access to. It will break down the cost on the basis of the number of users and the number of session. And there has been some recent changes which has been made, and I want to touch upon that when I'll show you the pricing calculator. And the good thing is that you can export these in an Excel format. So in case you are trying to present this to maybe your end user, you can share the link or you can export this in an Excel format. And the good thing is that the price that you see is all MSRP. If you want to add maybe your own margins, you can tweak that within that Excel sheet and present it that to your customer. Now at this stage, I'm going to go to the pricing calculator and show you where you can find this service. So if you go and Google search and type in Azure Pricing Calculator, it will take you to this page. This is a tool from Microsoft. And once you log in into this one, you can always export it in the Excel sheet, and you can also share the link. Now, on the left side, you see that it highlights under what category you can find different services. But this is search bar is really handy. Depending upon what service you're trying to find, you can just type in that in this global search. For example, if I'm trying to search for Azure Virtual Desktop, it will take me to this page. You can either go this way and find this service, or you can go under Compute, and you will see that it is part of the Compute with Azure Virtual Desktop here. So I'm going to add this. And go to View. You can always give the name. So say, for example, if you're trying to create this for a specific company, you can name this, say, for example, ABC Incorporation, right? Or actually, let's say Contoso. And prior to this option, you need to go and add different components which are associated with Azure Virtual Desktop Deployment. But this has been the recent change with this pricing calculator. As you can see, different components which are there are added automatically for you. And you can obviously tweak it based on your requirements. So I'm just going to go back on top. Now, first option, obviously, you need to decide on the region. And this is going to be important not only from the performance that the customer will get, because you want obviously the resources closer to their user location. This will also ultimately affect pricing that will come in the end, because different region has a different real estate pricing, and based on that, one region may have higher pricing as compared to another. So something to keep in mind, right, that you need to consider. Now, once you are sure under what region you want to deploy the resources, you also need to figure out what kind of deployment it is. As I mentioned, you can deploy this in a personal or in a pool kind of environment. You can have a one-on-one relationship, or you can share the resources. You can pick one over the other. So in this example, I'm going to use with a pool kind of environment. Then when you use a pool environment, it is going to be multi-session, right? Because you're going to share the resources. If you see the single session, then there are certain things which are removed, but I'm going to take the example of multi-session over here. And then you need to pick what kind of workload type it is going to be. Now that translates into the application and what are the requirements. Based on that, your instance count will change. For example, if I use just a light workload type, you can see I need 19 instance based on the number of users. If I change it to say medium or heavy, this number will keep on increasing. But let's take example of a medium workload and change this user base to 100. So there are 100 users which are going to use a multi-session, so it's going to be shared among users, and the workload type is medium. And I'm also going to change this number to 730 hours, which is basically assuming that these machines will be running 24/7. You can always tweak this property, right, depending upon, because we come across a lot of organizations which are not using these workloads 24/7. But I just want to show you how you can get the maximum cost by just going through the total usage hours. So that's why I changed it to 730 hours, but feel free to change the number. One thing I also want to point out over here is that, and that's one of the limitations of this pricing calculator, that you can go less than 100 users. So say, for example, if I go and try to price this opportunity for 50 users, and if I click anywhere, this user changes to 100. Hopefully that will change in the future, but that is where it is. But one workaround with this one, I can show you is that you see for 100 users, we need 6 instances, and I'm going to explain that to you in a moment. If I change it to say 50, you see this instance count goes down. So for 50 users with a medium kind of workload, it is saying that I need only 3 instances. The only thing is that I should not be clicking anywhere outside. If I click anywhere outside, this instance count changes to 6. But hopefully that will change, but that's at least gives you an idea about, because I know there are a lot of SMB partners and they have user base of less than 100. And if they are trying to price it out, there is a limitation, but this will at least gives you an idea about how you can look at and how many instance count you need to provision. So let's take example of 100 users. So in this case, it is saying that we need 6 instances. Obviously, you can tweak the concurrency. So it's saying that this is almost 90 to 95% of multiple users will be concurrently accessing these. So there's some intelligence built in within this pricing calculator, but you can always tweak it. But I have changed this to 730 hours. So I don't think so that's going to have major impact. So based on 100 users running the 730 hours, we have 6 instances, and it is saying that we'll be deploying D4S version 3 machine with 4 CPUs with 16 gig of RAM, right? And then it is going to be a pay-as-you-go. Now, another option that you can utilize with this AVD deployment are the reserve instances. So if you go with 1 year or 3 year, if you have noticed, my compute cost is automatically dropped. So if you think that if the customer comes back to you and saying that this compute is on a higher side, you can always lean back to reserve instances. Basically, it is like locking down your resources. And if you are here to stay with for 1 year or 3 year in Azure environment, Microsoft is going to incentivize for you. And based on the duration, say, for example, for 1 year, it is almost 40% of saving on the compute. And on 3 year, it is around about 62%. So based on that, obviously, the discussion, we can always change it. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to leave it to pay as you go, but you can always tweak that property here. So that was the compute. So there are 6 instances as part of this host pool. And then obviously we need to have the storage attached to this, right? Your operating system or maybe even your data disk. And there are different tiers in this one. We have standard SSD, we have premium category, and depending upon, again, what are the requirement for the application and what kind of experience you want to give, you can pick one or the other. Typically, it is recommended that you use a premium SSD for these demonstration. So I'm going to use an example of premium SSD, and you can use disk type of 128, 256. You can see that there are different categories. So for 6 instances, it is saying that obviously we need 6 disks. So that's why you see. So in this example, I'm using 128 gig of storage, and you see the corresponding cost associated for this. This is a monthly cost basically, but you can always change this, how big you want that storage to be. So these were the machines within the host rule based on 100 user count. Then you also have the file storage category. And this is being used for your user profile in conjunction with FS Logic. And in this view, you can only see the premium file storage or the Azure native file, but there are some of the other tiers available with Azure File Storage, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But let's say, for example, you want to use Azure File Storage, then you need to also specify how much storage you need over here. So let's say I'm trying to provision 100 gig for this user base, right? So you'll see the associated cost with that for 100 gig of data with premium file storage. And then you also have the snapshot. So obviously this needs to be protected, and Azure File Storage fully gels with Azure Backup, which I'm going to talk about later in the slides today. But you also need to have snapshots in place, because that's going to take whatever snapshot you're taking is going to take that much space, right? And based on how much are the snapshots configured, what is the policy, we need to put aside some cost associated with that, right? So let's say for 10 gig, it is $36. So you have that component too with premium file storage for user profile. And other component, which I will say is the most difficult to compute, are the bandwidth charges. Now, depending upon, again, how that is configured, putting the data in inside your Azure, in your virtual network within Azure, there is no cost, but you are, when you're trying to pull the data out, whether there is a VPN connectivity or something like that, there is going to be a bandwidth charges for that. And that also needs to be taken into perspective, and based on which region we are talking about, the cost will be associated. So say, for example, we are deploying this in East US, and it is routed via the Microsoft Global Network, which is the recommended way. Your cost will be associated. And there are different tiers available. For example, if it is between 0 to 5 gig of egress charges, there is no cost associated. But if you go more than that, there are different tiers available. So say, for example, if I change this number to 100 gig, that is how much is the cost for 100 gig of internet egress charges, right? And this can be changed. And that is where the POC will come into play. Now, once we input these information, this gives us breakdown of per user, how much is going to be the cost. So you have the virtual machine cost based on 100 users, the storage cost, also cost of the file storage. We also have the bandwidth, and this is on an average, how much is the total cost per user we are talking about here, right? And you can always change the currency. So this is the default, it's in Canadian dollar, but if as a Canadian partner, you want to price this out, you can always change the currency into Canadian dollar. This is pay as you go, assuming that these machines are running 24/7, but you can also make use of reserve instances. And once this is saved, right, you can save this and say, for example, for Contoso Incorporation, I can also export this in an Excel format in case you want to present it. I can also share the link, right, with my respective user and give them access. And if they want to tweak it, maybe later on that can be done. So definitely a great tool. And if I open my Excel sheet, you can see it over here for the Azure Virtual Desktop. These are the different components which are needed. And this is going to be your monthly cost on an average. And the cost that you see is basically your MSRP pricing. You can always add your margins, but this is your MSP price. And whatever tiers you fall under with Ingram Micro, that will be minus that. So say, for example, if you have 0 to 5,000 consumption, there are different tiers. And as you move up, your margin will keep on increasing. But the good thing is that this is an MSRP pricing, and you can add your services and present it to the end customer. So definitely a handy tool here when it comes to pricing out these opportunity. Actually, just want to show you one more thing quickly. For file storage, as I said that in this view, it is only giving us two options, premium file and Azure Native file. If you want to see more options where you can store your user profile, I can also go under storage, go to storage account. And based on the region I want to deploy under type, you can pick file storage, and you can see that there are different performance tier, right? The one option that we saw before was with premium tier, but you can also use cool, hot, transactional optimize, and based on that, you can also price the opportunity, right? So that's another way of pricing it out in which you can add separate components individually. All right. Hopefully that gives you a better understanding of how you can design and price this out opportunity. So with that, I'm going to further go to my deck. But one thing I want to point out that, yes, pricing calculator is great, but there is no one way of coming to what we're going to be the right fit. And that is why it is critical that POC is implemented, right, with any AVD deployment or in fact any cloud deployment. And that's why Ingram Micro has set aside certain POC funding where you can go and test it out. And based on that, you can pick the right tier or right node, or even from the storage perspective, what should be the performance tier. So that POC period going to be critical that you can utilize. But commonly used series of machines, as I said, that are D series are very popular. But if you want to maybe, and you're dealing with specific kind of workload, you want GPU accelerated machine and series machines are popular too because they have NVIDIA GeForce card associated. And you can also use some of the other third-party tools such as Nerdio or Lakeside, which a lot of customers they use for assessment or even for migrating their resources. With that, let's look into the image management, automation, and monitoring. Now, as I said that Azure Virtual Desktop is changing, there are more and more capabilities that has been added. And when Azure Virtual Desktop was released by Microsoft, it was all PowerShell heavy. What does that mean is most of the management and control, you have to go through scripting, and you used to use PowerShell for that. And people who had used classic WVD deployment, they must be aware of that, right? But a lot of things have changed in the last 2 years. Now Azure Virtual Desktop is a first-party services. It's a Azure Resource Manager deployment. It means that there are different ways you can manage different components of AVD. You can use Azure Portal. If you want to manage this through PowerShell or through command line interface, you can do that too. And the different components such as nodes with that host pool, or maybe the storage that you'll be utilizing, everything can be managed right from the portal and from the interface. And as I said that more and more capabilities are added, and then you'll continue to see that more features are added within this Azure Resource Manager deployment of AVD. Now let's look at this AVD Azure Resource Manager model a bit closely. So as you can see on the slide, any cloud deployment and AVD is no different, starts with a subscription. You might have heard about EA Enterprise Agreement subscription or CSP Cloud Solution Providers subscription, or more recent one, NCE, which is a new commerce experience subscription. Every deployment needs to have a subscription. And by the way, if you are using CSV, it is highly recommended that you move that to NCE. It is a seamless migration, basically. Just few steps, you can move that. And it will give you more added advantage from cost analysis budgeting, which was not part of the CSV subscription. Once you deploy the subscription, you can also manage that through Lighthouse. So if you are a partner which is managing multiple subscription, multiple tenant, you can use Azure Lighthouse. This gives you complete visibility across multiple tenants, and it's a free tool, so definitely use that. And under that subscription will reside your workspace, your host pool, as well as your application group. Now, workspace is nothing but logical grouping of your application group, and each application group needs to be associated with workspace. So the users who wants to have access to those, whether it's a full desktop or those application group, and they want to see that, your application group needs to be associated with workspace. Then you have these host pool in which your session host or the nodes or the virtual machine that the users are going to access will reside. As I mentioned before, there are two kinds of session hosts. You can have a pool in which user will be sharing their resources, or you can have a dedicated or a personal kind of workload in which each user will be assigned a dedicated machine. So depending upon what problem we are trying to solve and what are the application requirement, you can pick one over the other, but that is where the users will be establishing the session with. So that's going to reside within the host pool under session host. Then you have the application group, which is your logical grouping of different applications. And application group will be of two types. You have a desktop application group. Now, when you're spinning Azure Virtual Desktop, by default, it will create a desktop application group. You can additionally create remote applications also. So if there is a case scenario, you don't want to give full desktop experience to your user, you only want to give them remote application access, you can do that too. And all these things are done from application group, or you can give them combination of both. You can give them a combination of both the full desktop as well as remote application. But this is the hierarchy of Azure Virtual Desktop under Azure Resource Manager, starting with subscription, workspace, host pool, and application group. And then you have the session host within that. Image management is very critical with any virtualized desktop infrastructure deployment, and AVD is no different, right? People, they use different kind of tool. We also know that there is also collaboration, and some of the partners, they're also using third-party tools such as Nerdio and being very successful. You can use Azure native tools. So typically when you're trying to deploy any AVD environment, you want to deploy that from a golden image. Now you can use the image from the marketplace. So there are different image option available right from the marketplace that AVD that Microsoft provides, and they update these images on a regular basis. But if you want to bring your own image, you want to prep it, you want to load your own application, you can do that too. But I would say definitely make use of shared image gallery if you have not, because it's a great tool where you can store your images, you can customize it, and you can also maintain different versions for that. And most importantly, if you're going to deploy this in multiple region, you can share these images across multiple region, and all these things are done through right from the Azure portal. And this is a link which again I'm going to share with you, which gives you all the steps how to manage different version, how to replicate across multiple regions these images. So definitely have a look at that. And the good thing is that there is no separate cost associated with this, right? Shared image gallery is free. The only cost that you're going to pay is whatever is the cost for that storage that image going to use. But you can use combination of Azure native tools, or you can also collaborate with third parties such as Nerdio for those image management. Now, there are also different ways these application delivery can take place, right? And MSI app attach will dynamically attach those application when the users try to establish that session. And the good thing is that these applications will be only in read-only format. So these are mounted in form of hard drive. So the users who has been given access to these applications, they can mess with those applications because it's only in read-only format. And this is nothing but containerization of application, basically detaching your application from the operating system so that as a system admin, you have better control. You can manage, I think, the golden images in a better way, because then now with this MSI app attached, you don't need to load all those applications, because as you know that you can dynamically attach, mount this as a hard drive, and give access to those specific users, those remote application. Now, the other part of this MSI app attaches the session host within the host pool, and very similar to the FS logic, which FS logic profile, you also need to grant the NTFS permission. Now, if you're using Azure profiles, maybe with Windows Active Directory or with Azure Active Directory domain services, you will also need to grant that SMB contributor role to those respective users. But a great way of deploying your application and giving access to the user. And the good thing is that another change which has happened within this AVD functionality, prior you need to go and deploy this MSI app attached through PowerShell, but now that is also integrated within the Azure portal. You can specify where you want to store, whether it's in Azure file storage, and you can then provide the required access to respective users, and those applications will be mounted as a hard drive to them. Automation is going to be critical with AVD deployment. As I mentioned before that there are different scenarios which are unlocked with AVD, whether it's just a basic deployment and you want to use Azure Automation from deploying these machines within the host pool, or deploying this with domain services with virtual network. If you want to reduce the time, you can use maybe ARM templates to create that automation script. Also, how you want to automate and the machines within the host pool is also going to be critical. I gave example of an organization, right, which has multiple users who were trying to access the application, and they only had this requirement that they want to use it only, say, from Monday to Friday, and during weekends they don't need access, and they want to spin out those resources, and they wanted to use automation for that. And the good thing is that everything can be managed right from the automation in conjunction with Log Analytic Workspace. That is the tool basically Azure Automation will be using to store all those user profile. So Azure Automation, in simple term, is nothing but a platform as a service where you can use your own PowerShell scripts. It does support other languages such as Python, but the core here is that, to provide you the central repository where you can store your PowerShell script or your Python script, and that can be run not only against AVD environment or against your cloud environment, you can also these scripts against your on-prem environment. So if you have a hybrid kind of environment, maybe you want to use this for patching or for updates, you can also use Azure Automation. Also, on top of that, you can use this automation with logic apps. Another case scenario that we come across commonly is that a lot of partners, they wanted, based on peak hour and off-peak time, they want to add the host pool automatically, right? But at the same time, they want to make sure that they're not consuming the resources more than what they need. So Azure Automation, along with the Log Analytic Workspace, Elvis Logic apps will allow you to do that. Just want to point out certain things over here that if you have multiple host pools and you want to use Azure Automation for that, along with logic apps, you need to have a dedicated logic app for that host pool. You can share maybe Log Analytic Workspace, that's not a problem, but you need to have a specific logic app for specific host pool. But definitely a great component, not only to reduce the otherwise system admin, that the work that they have to do and spin up these resources. It will also help you to optimize the cost. It will spin down the resources so that you are using and saving the cost in the long run. but at the same time give all the capabilities to the users that that the machines can be added dynamically when the CPU count is increased in conjunction with logic app. So definitely a good tool to use. And there is a specific link that we'll be sharing with you, which will help you to understand how this tool works with Azure Automation. Monitoring of your AVD deployment is critical, right? With any other deployment, we need to diagnose this. We need to monitor this on an ongoing basis. And personally, I have seen challenges in partner base just because of the fact that what to monitor. Because as you know that Azure Virtual Desktop is a shared responsibility model. There are certain components which are managed by Microsoft for you, and there are certain components which are your responsibility. So it is not very clear what we should be monitoring in the first place. But just want to point out that there are multiple steps or multiple components within Azure Monitoring, but Azure Monitor is the tool we should be using in order to manage our session host, whether it's a storage and all other components that will be deployed. And for example, with any AVD deployment, there are three components which I have mentioned before too. There is a workspace, there is a session host, and you also have the application group. And when you go inside the Azure portal, within all these components, there is a diagnostic setting. In order for Azure Monitor to function, we need to make sure that all these three components are pointing to a log analytic workspace, and the data is stored over there, which can be further utilized to be analyzed. So that's going to be a step number one from the monitoring perspective. Now, once that is done, we also need to make sure that under Azure Monitor, the machines that are deployed within the host pool are enabled to be monitored with Azure Monitoring. So you can go under Azure Monitor and enable those machines. And once that is done, we also need to add the Windows performance counter. Now, depending upon what solution that we are trying to deploy, there are different Windows performance counter which will align with that solution, and same will apply for AVD. There's specific Windows performance counter that needs to be analyzed with Azure Virtual Desktop. And Christian Brunkoff from Microsoft has created a detailed step-by-step guide of which performance counter should be measured. And it is already in the link over here, which I will recommend to go through this. But once you add those Windows performance counter within Log Analytics Workspace, based on that, we can create different dashboard. We can visualize that data, which will be input into the Log Analytics Workspace. And based on that recommendation, we can do more digging into the problem in case there is somebody's facing in the AVD deployment. And also on top of that, we can also get the diagnostic and the diagnostic logs from Azure Active Directory. But once you enable that, everything will be funneled through Log Analytics Workspace, and then you can also run custom query. You can create your own, as I said, that your dashboards, your pie chart, and visualize this from ongoing monitoring as well as diagnostic perspective. But critical, like any other deployment, we need to still analyze and diagnose and monitor this, and Azure Monitor is a tool that we should be using it. Security is going to be critical. And one tool that you should be using, if not all of them, to get a bird's eye view of what is happening in your subscription will be the Azure Defender, which is part of Azure Security Center. Now, Azure Security Center, as you know, comes in two flavors. You get a free tier and you get a standard tier, which has been now changed to Azure Defender. Not to be confused with the Windows Defender, which is another tool from Microsoft. But this will make sure that as a system admin, you can come at one place and under different category, whether it's your nodes within the host pool, the storage, or your identity, whatever different components, you can get recommends and prompts from Microsoft under this category. And based on those recommend, there is also one quick fix that you can apply. I I generally call this as a health score, right? The more security policies that you apply to this, your health score will keep on increasing. But this will give you complete visibility. And as you know, Microsoft has invested billions of dollars to provide you that kind of security within the AVD platform and in general in Azure platform. So definitely make use of this. And as you can see, there is a health score over here. There's a quick fix. If there is an encryption is not enabled on that VM or that storage is not properly configured, it will prompt you to do that. But everything can be managed from one interface under Azure Defender within Security Center. And these are some of the best practices in the document that we can also go through. Now, high availability and disaster recovery also is critical, especially from Azure Virtual Desktop. And I also want to touch upon certain concepts that you need to be aware of, because as I said again, it's a shared responsibility. Yes, the components such as connection broker, gateway, those things are all taken care by Microsoft, but what happens to the machines? And depending upon what kind of deployment we have, RHA and DR will depend upon those things, right? Whether the machines are in a pool kind of environment or in a personal, whether AVD infrastructure in one region or within multiple region. And then based on that, we can use tools such as you can use availability set zones, you can use a specific kind of file storage, and you can maybe use Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup. So I just want to take some time here talking about different concepts that you need to know from HA and DR perspective. So by default, Azure is deployed with redundancy built in. As you know that Azure has multiple regions and each region consists of multiple data center. And I'll take example of a East US location. So say, for example, when you're trying to deploy AVD environment and you deploy a single VM with a premium storage, there is a specific SLAs that are associated or service level agreement associated with that. It will give you 99.9% of uptime, basically. But what happens in case this machine goes down? And by the way, by default, Microsoft also keep 3 copies of your data. So in case one copy goes down, Microsoft can make use of the second or the third copy to make sure that that data is intact. But what happens in case that machine goes down and we don't have any high availability in place, right? The user won't be able to access those application. You need to have maybe restore that from the backup or even from replicate to another region by using Azure Site Recovery. Now that's where some of the other high availability concepts comes into play, and that is what you see in the middle. You have availability sets and you have availability zones. Now, when you're deploying this AVD deployment, it will give you the option, depending upon if that option is there, because I know there are certain region, for example, Canada East, there is no option of availability zone, it's only availability set. So depending upon which region we are talking about, so let's say East US, because I know both these options are there for that, you can pick between availability sets and availability zone. Now, the difference between the two, as you can see that there is a 99.95 SLA versus 99.99 for availability zone. So once you deploy the machines, your session host within the host pool within the availability set, it will make sure that they are on separate fault domain and update domain. Now, what does that mean as you know, that these machines are residing on a hypervisor such as an Hyper-V, and these hypervisor needs to be updated. Now, what happens if you only have one machine, right? And that is getting updated, the hypervisor is getting updated. And while that is getting updated, if a user is trying to access that, there's going to be a downtime. They won't be able to. Now, once you deploy the machines within the availability set, it will make sure that not two machines at the same time will be updated. So if one machine is updating, the other one won't, because Microsoft is going to keep this in separate nodes, right? Separate hypervisor. That's one thing. Other thing is that each nodes in the Microsoft data center is connected to a physical switch. And what happens if that physical switch goes down? Again, going back to the example, if you have only one machine, then you need to rely on the backup or on replication to bring that machine up, and you'll experience downtime, right? So that's why if you deploy two machines within the availability set, they will have on separate fault domain and separate update domain. So they're not going to share the same switch, and they're not going to share the same hypervisor. And that is where the availability set will come into play. It will give you higher SLAs as compared to a single VM. Now you also have this concept of availability zone, which has even higher service level agreement. Now, what does that mean and how it is different from availability zone? Now, again, taking example of a region, say, for example, we are deploying our resources in East US. A region like in East US will consist of multiple data center. And let's say I have deployed an availability set in a data center. And what happens if that complete data center goes down? Now, each data center has its own power supply, its own electricity. And if that data center goes down, even if I have deployed that in availability set, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 machine, I'll experience downtime. Now, with availability zone deployment, it will also protect me from the data cell level failure in that Azure region, because your node will be spanning across multiple nodes, right? So as I said that East US will have multiple data center. If you're deploying that with availability zone, one region goes down, one data center within that region goes down, you have still the node placed in that other region, and the user will be still able to access those workloads and those applications. So something to keep in mind when you're trying to design this from high availability perspective. And obviously you have this option of a paired region. There is a concept in Microsoft that a region is paired. The idea behind is that the definition of a paired region is that, first of all, it has to be separated by certain distance, certain miles from one region. And the other thing is that that should be still within the geographical boundary of that country. For example, in Canada, we have two regions, like Canada Central is paired with Canada East. And same thing applies for the US region. The idea being that even if you are failing over and it's getting replicated, your data still remains. And you can always use the disaster recovery option, which I'm going to talk about in the coming slide. Azure Site Recovery, you might have heard about, is the disaster recovery tool or the business continuity model. It can be used not only for your on-prem environment. So if you're trying to replicate and use Azure as a DR site, but in case you're trying to provide a highly available solution from Azure Virtual Desktop perspective, you can use Azure Site Recovery as a business continuity. For example, as you can see on this slide, you have AVD deployment in an East US location. You can replicate that into a target environment, say Central US, and all your workloads will be replicated. And again, that will depend upon what kind of workload. And Azure Site Recovery shines best when you're using AVD with Azure Site Recovery in a personal kind of deployment in which you have a dedicated machine for users, right? And those machines will be replicated and can be brought up in case something happens to your primary region. So definitely a great tool, but again, it will depend upon what kind of deployment and what kind of session host we are deploying. Now, we can always use Azure Backup Services, and it's again a platform as a service which can be used for protecting your AVD workload, not only the virtual machines within the host pool, but also the storage account in which your user profiles are saved, right? The good thing is that there is no infrastructure that needs to be deployed. You can use this for protecting your whole VM. You can restore a single file, or you can restore the whole VM by using Azure Backup Services. And similar to that, you can also use the file shares to protect. So the snapshot that we talked about initially, it's fully integrated with the Azure Backup Services. You can take snapshots of your file share where your user profiles are saved with FS logics. And in case something happens to those user profile, you can bring it back. And again, you can restore maybe to a different region. There are different recovery service vault with different redundancy you can create. You can have the data within one region, which is locally redundant storage, or you can replicate that to maybe a secondary region called the geo-redundant storage. So again, depending upon the requirement, you can pick one over the other, but the Azure VM, which is going to be part of your host pool, as well as the Azure file backup, which is going to be uh, storing for your user profile, is fully integrated with Azure Backup, which can be used here. The Azure Virtual Desktop ecosystem is growing continuously, which you can leverage to deploy and manage, right? That shows how much confidence these partners are showing. And some of them you might be already using. I know a lot of partners, they are using Sipajo, maybe you're using maybe PrinterLogic or Nerdio. So there's so many options available when you want to deploy that hardware, you want to apply the security or ongoing management and monitoring. So definitely make use of these partners. There are certain partners that we deal directly at Ingram Micro. So if you want some more information about these tools and how that you can leverage to enhance the AVD portfolio, you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to schedule a call with you. Now, at this stage, I'm just going to flip over to the Azure Portal just to show you how you will spin these services, though you're going to do everything from scratch in tomorrow's lab. But I just want to give you the feel where you're going to find these services so that's easy for you. Hopefully you can see the Azure Portal I'm logged into. You can see I'm logged in with my credential. And the best way to reach Azure Virtual Desktop is to search for the service. I can just search in the global search bar and it will take me to this option. Or I can also expand these three lines here on the top left corner and go to all services and search for Azure Virtual Desktop here. So there are different ways you can reach it, and then you can also pin it under the favorite the way I've done it here. So if I go and expand this, you can see it takes me to the Azure Virtual Desktop blade, and from here I can create my host pool and go through the process. And all these things can be obviously automated, in which you can pick your subscription. Like any other deployment, AVD also you need to have in a resource group, which is like logical grouping of your resources that you're going to do. So you need to deploy that in a resource group. If you have already one, you can pick the same one. Here, if you want to create new, you can obviously create from here too. You can give the host pool name you want. You can pick your preferred location. So as you know that, as I mentioned before, it was not their metadata location to be deployed in Canada, but now you can also deploy that within the Canadian Central region. So that's a good thing. You can pick your host pool type. You want to have a pool or you want to have a personal. So both the options are there. So if you use the pool one, it also gives you the option of what kind of load balancing algorithm you want to use, right? You have the breadth first or you have the depth first. Breadth first basically is like a round robin. So as you have multiple machines within the host pool, one session will go to the first machine, then the second will go to the second one, and it will go back and forth like that one. If you have the depth first, then you can specify how many users will have a session on one single machine before they go to the other machine. So there is a couple of flexibility in terms of what kind of load balancing algorithm you want to use. But the good thing is that it's highly available. It's all taken care in the backend for Microsoft for you. So you don't need to worry about deploying those load balancer. I can add the virtual machine, and depending upon the requirement, I can pick what kind of virtual machines I want. I can deploy this in resource group. I can put the name prefix. So that will be appended in front of the machines that I'm going to deploy within the host pool. I can pick which virtual machine location I want to use. And as I mentioned, you can pick what kind of redundancy you want. You can pick with an availability zone or with availability set, depending upon the requirement and what kind of SLA you want to give to your customer. Now for the images, you can pick the images right from the gallery, right? So you can see that Microsoft has a lot of options in terms of images. If I can expand this, oh, they also have the Windows 11 now. Okay, that's great. I think that went GA. Windows 11 went GA, I think, yesterday. So that is also added. So they keep on adding more and more images. But if you want to add and bring your own custom image, you can also go to My Item. And the example I gave for shared image gallery, you can upload those images. You can manage different versioning for that one. And if you want to replicate between multiple regions, you can always do that. So definitely both these options are available for you. I can pick what kind of node size also I want, right? So depending upon the requirement, I can pick, depending upon that region, there are different workload categories which are added. I can do that. I can enable different diagnostic options, how I want to monitor and manage that. You can deploy that within a virtual network. And another thing, as you can see, that has changed is the option of domain join. You can see we have both the options now. Prior to this, we used to have only Active Directory. And if you're using Active Directory, you need to fill up the information. So the person who has the administrative right to domain join those machines. But now you can also have a full Azure Active Directory joined and enroll them under the Intune. And when you do that, you see there are certain lines which are removed. You don't need to provide that enterprise admin and those credentials, right? So those options are there for you. I talked about workspace. Every deployment needs to be associated with the workspace. It's like logical grouping of your application group. So that needs to be done. And you also you can optionally enable the diagnostic settings and all those, you can do it. And once you review and create, that will be up and running for you, right? Depending on how many machines. Now, in my case, I already have a host pool with the name IMC here, you can see. And under manage, you see I have different components, host pool, application group, workspace. And if I go and expand this under this host pool, I have two machines over here, right? So there are two machines which are there as part of this deployment. It's and in a pool kind of deployment. And for monitoring, I can also enable diagnostic setting by going to monitoring and add diagnostic setting. And depending upon what log I want to put to the log analytic workspace, I can check these boxes and send that to log analytic workspace for my monitoring on an ongoing basis. Very similar to the host pool, same thing, diagnostic settings can be also enabled on the application group as well as at the workspace level. So very similar to the host pool, the way I showed you, that can be enabled. But I'm just going to back to the host pool here and just going to expand this. You can see under manage, I also have the application group, and now I also have the MSIX app package option, which used to be PowerShell. The only option was PowerShell, but now that is integrated within the portal. Now, if I go and expand my application group, I only have one desktop application group, which is assigned by default when you create. But if you want to add remote application group, you can always do that. There's a lot of options available. But if I go and expand this and go under manage, I can have application. I can add more application if you want, right? With the MSIX app attach, I can add more nodes within the host pool on the fly as my requirement grows. But if I go under assignments, you can see I have two users which has been given access to these host pool. I have test 1 and test 2. If I want to add more users, I can always do that and add those users from here. If I want to remove and access to these users, I can just check this box and remove that access. But in this case, I have two users with the name test 1 and test 2 who can access that desktop application group. And they can access this through different options. They can use Windows operating system, Linux, they can use Android, iOS, they can use the client that can be deployed on the machine, or they can use just through the web interface on which I am right now. So let me just try to access this desktop application group which has been assigned. by putting the credentials. All right, so in my case, I have not configured multi-factor authentication or conditional access policy, but those solutions can be put in place and highly recommended so that no unauthorized access is given to users, and only which has been assigned, they are only able to access those applications or those desktops. So I'm just trying to access this. Otherwise, it would have sent me to authenticate with one more step. It can be through an authenticator app, or it can be through an SMS message. It can be configured within the Azure portal by the system admin. So you can see that I'm logging into this machine. My FS logic profiles is also there in place, so it's kicking in. So as the user, so right now it's using to one specific machine. Tomorrow they come to and log into other machine. Their user profiles and settings will be taken with them, and they will get the seamless experience. So you can see now it's establishing the connection, and the machine is booting up. All right. So you see it's now logging in now, and now they have the access to what have been assigned to them. All right. So with this, it brings us to the end of this presentation. As I said during the initial remarks, we are going to have hands-on labs tomorrow, and after these 3 days are over, we are also going to have a one-on-one session based on your scenarios, and if you need to get deep on certain topics, we can have that too. So the sales team is going to reach out to. But at this time, I will say if there's any question maybe in the chat that needs to be addressed, we can take it.
We did have a question come in earlier during the session. Is Canada East supported for VNet connectivity for Windows 365? It isn't supported.
Good question. As far as I know, if you're saying from VNet, I believe they're asking for the metadata location connectivity, if that's what they meant. I think that is there. And if you want to integrate from your on-prem environment with your deployment in Canada East, you can establish site-to-site VPN or Express route. So I will say yes.
Thank you. And then one more question was, is it feasible to manage host uptime on Azure, or do we need to use a third-party tool like Nerdio?
I will say that you can manage that from the Azure portal. There are different monitoring capabilities which has been enhanced in the last 6 months. It will all depend upon the comfort level. If you're already using maybe Nerdio for some of the other implementation, if you feel comfortable with that, I would say there is nothing wrong with that. A lot of our partners are actually using, but I think the native capability should work too.
Thank you. And those were the 2 questions that came through. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other questions. You can either type it here or hop off mute and ask away. Well, I'm guessing we don't have any more questions, and it is 12:30. So thank you for joining today, everyone. Again, just to repeat what Girish said, for tomorrow's session, if one person from each partner can join the lab environment, just have them join for tomorrow's session. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.